Until this point in our retelling of A Song of Ice and Fire, we have neglected to mention one of the key players in this tale. To remedy this, we will now detail the trials and tribulations of Jon Snow. The bastard son of Eddard Stark was raised in acrimony, always feeling apart from those who were supposed to be his siblings, and instilled with a firm belief that unless he were to depart from Winterfell, his life would be an unfulfilled one. This upbringing would inspire this child, born in the dying embers of Robert's rebellion, to become his own man, and in doing so, forge a path for himself which may yet have immense implications for Westeros and its people. Jon Snow might be accused of knowing nothing, but the same can't be said for anyone spying on your digital life. Such internet wargs aren't all powerful though. Slip by with a disguise of many faces by using our sponsor for this video, Private Internet Access. This is a worldwide VPN service that encrypts your data and routes it through a server of your choice. This comes with two big advantages. Firstly, it gets very hard to spy on or steal your data, which is especially important if you use public Wi-Fi, where such things are usually quite easy. But more excitingly, it allows you to bypass region locking on loads of online services. Take Netflix for example. When you pay for their library, they will only give you a certain amount of it based on your device's location. But with private internet access, your VPN can connect from all over the world, forcing Netflix and the like to show you what they really have in store for you. Now you can get private internet access on an unlimited number of devices with a single subscription, so you're buying protection for your whole life and whole household, and full access to your streaming services for everyone. Go to piavpn.com/ww to get 83% off your subscription, bringing the price down to $2.03 per month. Plus it gets you 4 months added on top for free. Link in the description. At the conclusion of the rebellion against the Mad King, when all was said and done, Robert Baratheon sat on the Iron Throne, forever altering the course of the history of the Seven Kingdoms. Of all the dramatic twists in that seminal war, perhaps the most surprising was that Eddard Stark, the noblest man in the realm, had besmirched the very honor he held so dear by way of siring a bastard son. Following the defeat of the Mad King and the death of his sister Lyanna, Ned made his way back to his ancestral seat of Winterfell, bringing with him not only his retinue, but also the bastard son he had named Jon. This drew a frosty reception from his wife Catelyn, and this animosity was only furthered by the patriarch of the Stark family's abject refusal to speak of the boy's parentage. Jon was raised amongst the Stark children, with Ned displaying a fierce protectiveness towards the boy, ensuring that he received an education befitting a true scion of House Stark. As a result, the bastard grew close with his true-born siblings, Robb and Arya, yet less so with Sansa, who treated him with disdain as her mother did. This relatively comfortable existence was soon to change with a portent of the coming of winter, which was encountered when the Stark retinue returned from the execution of a deserter of the Night's Watch. During their home journey to Winterfell, the party discovered a dead direwolf who had left a litter of pups. Upon Jon's suggestion, the pups were not executed, but instead given to each of the Stark children to raise. Jon received the runt of the litter, an albino pup whom he named Ghost. Due to his bastard status, Jon was deemed unworthy to sit with his true-born siblings at the feast welcoming King Robert to the north. During the festivities, he spoke with Benjen Stark, the first Ranger of the Night's Watch. Here, Jon set his heart upon joining the Brotherhood, fully aware that his prospects as a bastard were limited, even despite the kindness his father had displayed throughout the years. This process was hastened by Ned's acceptance of the title of Hand of the King, which necessitated that he head toward King's Landing. Catelyn was unwilling to keep Jon in Winterfell in her husband's absence, and Ned could not bring this bastard to court. Therefore, it was agreed that he would go north to the Wall. This arrangement pleased Catelyn, as due to the vows Jon would have to take with the Watch, he would be unable to sire sons who would challenge her own offspring's claim to Winterfell. Jon's dreams of joining a brotherhood of like-minded, stalwart guardians of civilization were soon dispelled, when, upon arriving at the Wall, he discovered that the Night's Watch of old had been fundamentally altered into an unrecognizable tapestry of criminals and exiles. Initially, Jon allowed his resentment of his current station to bleed into how he treated his fellow recruits, resulting in a confrontation between them. Only after a conversation with the armourer of Castle Black, Donal Noye, Jon realised he had treated the others in much the same way he had once been treated due to his status as a bastard. After this, Jon won the respect of his fellow recruits by displaying the characteristics of a great leader, mentor, and most importantly, friend. However, his popularity also won him the undying hatred of the Master-at-Arms, Sir Alliser Thorne. Jon's closest friend at the Wall was Samwell Tarly, a rotund man most unsuited to the rigours of the Black, and who could only take his vows due to Jon convincing Maester Aemon to take him as his personal steward. Following the end of the training period among the recruits, Jon believed he had proved himself to be a worthy candidate for the Rangers. Thus, he was shocked and dismayed when Lord Commander Mormont named him his personal steward. This fury was somewhat tempered when Samwell informed Jon that he was being intentionally kept close at the Lord Commander's side to groom him for a leadership position. Jon and Sam decided to take their vows before a set of weirwood trees north of the Wall. During this time, Ghost returned with the hand of Jaffa Flowers. This led the Brothers of the Night's Watch to their fallen companions, Jaffa and Othor, who were brought back to Castle Black. That same night, the two corpses arose as wights and came within a hair's breadth of taking the Lord Commander's life, had it not been for Jon's timely intervention. As a reward for his valiant efforts, Jon was awarded Longclaw, a Valyrian steel bastard sword, and treasured heirloom of the Mormont family. In recognition of House Stark's blood that ran through his veins, Jon had the Mormont bear's head pommel replaced with that of a direwolf. Jon's heart was torn apart when news reached Castle Black that Robb Stark had called his banners and marched south. Despite the counsel of Maester Aemon, who was revealed to be a Targaryen, Jon still decided to abandon his vows, despite the death penalty which came with it, and ride south to join his brother. He was swayed from this course of action when his friends among the Watch pursued him and convinced him to return to the Brotherhood. The following morning, the Lord Commander berated the young bastard, and, properly chastised, Jon fully committed to the Night's Watch. This would come at a pivotal point, serving as a crossroads for the Watch. Benjen Stark had gone missing in the interim, which, in conjunction with other ill tidings from beyond the Wall, made Jeor Mormont certain of only one true path forward. The Night's Watch would lead a ranging north in a show of force that had not been seen in generations, and discover for themselves if the casualties could be attributed to the wildlings alone or something even more sinister. The Great Ranging began with all preparations having been made, yet the initial portents left an uncertain picture for the party. The 200-strong company from Castle Black, supplemented by a further 100 rangers from the Shadow Tower, were encountered by naught more than silence. The wildling villages they rode past, including Whitetree, were abandoned. Only at Craster's Keep were they informed of a new King Beyond the Wall, who had united the fiercely independent wildlings in the Frostfangs. This man was not unknown to the Night's Watch, for it was none other than the former ranger Mance Rayder, who had even visited Winterfell during Jon's youth. This news, though disheartening, did not alter the conviction of the Lord Commander, who ordered that his men continue onwards towards the Fist of the First Men. Upon their arrival at the Fist, the Night's Watch discovered that the defences were in a state of disrepair. Jeor quickly ordered renovations to the site to defend against any oncoming assault, regardless of the foe which marched out to meet them. The breaches in the low ring wall were filled in with timber, while an additional set of timber stakes were set up. In addition, the slopes surrounding the hill were outfitted with caltrops. Meanwhile, while following his direwolf, Jon came across an old mound which Ghost dug up, uncovering dragonglass weapons and an old warhorn wrapped in a Night's Watch cloak, which Jon distributed among his brothers. Not long after, the 100 men of the Shadow Tower, led by the living legend Qhorin Halfhand, arrived at the Fist. Qhorin reported that they had been waylaid by a wildling scouting party commanded by Alfyn Crowkiller. Fortunately, they prevented the wildlings from reporting the encounter to Mance. Though the ensuing skirmish had come at a relatively high cost, as 4 brothers lay slain and a further dozen wounded. A wildling prisoner Corin took during the battle subsequently informed the Lord Commander that Mance was currently searching for a form of magic capable of bringing down the wall. The Half-Hand subsequently selected Jon to be among the 3 scouting parties to assess the mountain passes. The other 2 were commanded by Jarmin Buckwell and Thorin Smallwood respectively. Following the ascent up the treacherous mountains, Corin's party ambushed several wildling sentries in the Skirling Pass. Jon killed the first sentry with little difficulty. However, his blade was stayed when he discovered his second target was a woman. Rather than execute her on sight, he took the distinctly fiery-haired wildling as a captive. As they continued their trek through arduous terrain, Corin ordered Jon to execute the wildling sentry. Despite his duty, Jon's blade stayed once more, for he could not bring himself to kill an unarmed woman. Instead, Jon let her go free. In her parting words, the woman promised Jon that Mance would welcome him among the free folk should he ever defect from the Night's Watch to join them. That night, Jon dreamt through the eyes of Ghost, and in doing so, laid eyes upon the massive host that Mance had assembled against the Watch. Thousands of wildlings, supplemented by giants and mammoths, were shown to him, only for his vision to be cut short when an eagle attacked Ghost. Jon informed the group of what he saw. Surprised, the watchmen supposed that the young bastard was a warg, an unusual talent in the current age. The situation turned from bad to worse when the Night's Watch came across a wounded Ghost and spotted the eagle that had attacked the hound flying overhead. This caused Corin to decide to return to the Fist with all haste. The wildlings remained in hot pursuit, and to delay them, Corin ordered Dalbridge, a veteran ranger of the Shadow Tower, to buy them as much time as possible in a desperate rearguard action. The Half-Hand further ordered Ebon and Stonesnake, the other company members, to make their way to the Fist as quickly as possible to inform the Lord Commander of what they had seen. This left Corin alone with Jon, with the former ordering the latter to join the wildlings and to do what was required to win their trust. Though Dalbridge fought with the true ferocity of a member of the Night's Watch, it was not long before the wildling party, with Rattleshirt at their head, came upon the pair. Jon immediately yielded to their superior numbers and renounced his loyalties to the Watch, which drew the feigned disdain of his companion. Nevertheless, further proof would be required of the bastard's loyalty before the wildlings could accept him among their number. To that end, Rattleshirt demanded that Jon slay the Half-Hand. A duel ensued, and Jon was initially hard-pressed against the wily Shadow Tower veteran. Ghost intervened, mauling the warrior, and with a sufficient show put on, Corin allowed the younger man to bring an end to his watch. Although Rattleshirt was disappointed by the intervention of the direwolf, he kept his word and brought Jon back to their camp to meet the King Beyond the Wall. To ensure that Corin's sacrifice was not in vain, Jon would have to set aside his honor and vows for his imminent meeting with the unifier of the wildlings, an act which would not come easily to any scion of House Stark. Yet in this instance, Jon was fortunately able to achieve what his father could not, and set aside his principles, even momentarily, for the sake of his brothers. Although Jon initially did not recognize the true King Beyond the Wall, believing Tormund or Styr to be Mance, he quickly regained his footing and addressed the man who presented himself as naught more than a bard. Now addressing the true king, Jon feigned anger at those who raised him for his apparent poor treatment due to his illegitimate parentage. As a result, Mance Rayder could empathize with the young man, and perhaps see something of himself in the boy who seemed intent on setting aside the black. Furthermore, Mance allowed Jon to be privy to his plans, which would not be limited to the Night's Watch's destruction and the Wall's storming. Rather, the King Beyond the Wall wished to invade the Seven Kingdoms, and in doing so, carve out a dominion for his people, free from the infighting and harsh conditions which had long engulfed the far north. However, a greater reason pushed Mance desperately to unite the disparate far north, for the long night was approaching, and the denizens of the dark, icy depths of the Land of Always Winter were rising once more. This was a fact that those who dwelled within Westeros' Seven Kingdoms remained blissfully unaware of, including the Brothers of the Night's Watch, despite the initial reasoning behind their order's founding. These beings of myth and legend would soon become a stark reality for those camped upon the Fist of the First Men, bringing a premature end to the Great Ranging. While Jon had worked his way into the ranks of the Free Folk as an undercover spy for the Night's Watch, the position of the Night's Watchman on the expedition beyond the Wall soon proved to be untenable. Lord Commander Jeor Mormont sent out search parties to ascertain the wildlings' position, while ordering the rest of his men to refortify their position. However, the works conducted on the already lackluster defences would prove to be little more than a mild inconvenience for what was to come. While Jeor waited for the last of the search parties to return to the main force, a horde erupted from the winter mists, hundreds of wights ranging from reanimated humans to animals assaulting the Fist. The Watchmen quickly formed a defensive line, with archers upon the Fist repeatedly firing volleys into the trudging horde of wights. Yet, to their fear and dismay, this had little effect on their undead foes, who continued their interminable ascent. As they did so, the wights began to fall upon the defenders, making quick work of what had already been a meagre force. Lord Commander Mormont soon realized the situation was a desperate one. In a Hail Mary maneuver, he gathered a cadre of 50 men and broke through the never-ending tide of wights that continued to assail the fortification. Having made their way out of danger for the time being, Jeor Mormont ordered a forced march to Craster's Keep, as the remaining 250 men of the Night's Watch were slaughtered at the Fist. The Free Folk would come upon this scene soon after. Gazing lachrymosely upon the corpses, the King beyond the Wall would highlight the futility of the defence mounted at the Fist of the First Men. Had I been fool enough to storm this hill, I might have lost 5 men for every crow I slew, and still counted myself lucky. But when the dead walk, walls and stakes and swords mean nothing. Although Jon feared for his friends, who may have lay amongst the ranks of the dead at the Fist, he shirked not the oath he had sworn to Corin prior to his death. Continuing his defector's facade, he attempted the mission which Mance presented to him, agreeing to go south of the Wall with Ygritte as they joined the company commanded by Styr and Jarl for the treacherous crossing. Here, in what was to prove an uncharacteristic lapse of heart, Jon fell in love with Ygritte and broke his vow of chastity. Meanwhile, by the time the remaining 44 Night's Watchmen had completed their forced retreat to Craster's Keep, most of the survivors began to question the leadership of Lord Commander Mormont. Trapped within the hall due to horrific weather conditions raging outside, a further 4 men died, while another 8 were left incapacitated by way of wounds previously sustained or illness. This left a force of 32 men who were still capable of fighting, all of whom soon began to strain Craster's resources and patience. The tension came to a head when such members of the Watch demanded more food from Craster. When this was tersely turned down, they lost their temper and called Craster a bastard. Sufficiently angered, Craster vaulted the table to assault the Blackcloaks. Almost immediately, his throat was slit by a watchman, Dirk. Dirk then placed the still bloody knife to the throat of one of Craster's wives, demanding that she show them where the food stores were kept. Lord Commander Mormont attempted to intervene, demanding that Dirk unhand the woman. Here the altercation became a mutiny. Garth of Greenaway stood in his way, while Ollo Lophand stabbed his commander in the stomach. The chaos that ensued resulted in the death of several brothers, among them the Lord Commander, with a dozen loyalists returning to Castle Black to inform the now leaderless Watch of what had transpired upon the Great Ranging. Meanwhile, Jon successfully scaled the wall. Others in his party were unsuccessful and plunged thousands of feet to their deaths. The survivors of the party would then descend at Greyguard, entering the Gift. At this point, Jon was forced to make another difficult decision that was to haunt him in the days to come: whether he should abandon Ygritte, the love of his life, and return to the Watch, or embrace his lover, forever turning his back on the oaths he had sworn to the Brotherhood. This decision was effectively made for him when the company came to the abandoned Queenstown, and Styr ordered Jon to kill an elderly man who had been unable to evacuate the condemned village. When Jon refused, Ygritte killed the man instead. Before the wildlings could turn on Jon, the direwolf Summer, commanded by Jon's half-brother Bran, attacked the group. This allowed Jon to escape on horseback. However, he was wounded in the attempt as an arrow shaft pierced his leg during the escape. Further south, Robb Stark, the king in the north, was heading towards the twins and deliberating upon his potential successor. The king now believed his younger brothers Bran and Rickon to be dead due to the invasion of the Ironborn led by his former comrade Theon Greyjoy. Moreover, Arya was also believed to be dead, and Sansa was now wed to Tyrion Lannister. Therefore, to ensure the North did not fall under the dominion of the Lannisters, Robb was left with little choice but to decide upon his heir with the utmost haste. Dismissing the harsh objections of his mother Catelyn, he is believed to have legitimized his bastard brother Jon. This decision was apparently witnessed at Hag's Mire by Catelyn herself, Edmure Tully, Galbert Glover, Jason Mallister, Maggie Mormont and Jon Umber prior to the events of the Red Wedding at the Twins. In the meantime, Jon Snow, mortally wounded and barely conscious, arrived at Molestown on the back of his ardent steed. From here, he was brought to Castle Black, where his injuries were tended to by Maester Aemon. Soon his health began to improve. Unfortunately for Jon, he woke up to the tragic news that his brothers were ostensibly dead due to the treachery of Theon Greyjoy. In spite of Jon's efforts to warn the men at Castle Black of Mance's plans, Lord Steward Bowen Marsh had taken the bait set for him and left with the remaining fighting men to pursue the diversionary force who had struck to the west. On paper, this left the old and senile Castellan, Sir Winton Stout, with the old, the sickly and the greenest of recruits to defend Castle Black. In practice, the one-armed blacksmith Donal Noye effectively took command of the castle in Sir Stout's place. Moreover, Jon's warning was not entirely in vain, as Noye was now aware of the secondary group of raiders commanded by Styr, the Magnar of Thenn, who was ordered to attack Castle Black from the south. Donal quickly ordered the brothers available to him to retreat to the King's Tower, as the rest of the castle was not defensible from the south. He also offered refuge to the people of Molestown if they would be willing to aid in the defense. Despite Noye's best efforts, hundreds of Thenns quickly overwhelmed the defenders, pushing them from their positions before claiming the stairs from them. The Night's Watch was soon forced to retreat to the wall. However, unbeknownst to the Thenns, who believed that they had already carried the day, Noye had prepared for just such an eventuality. He had previously drenched the last landings with oil and ordered his smaller force to loose flaming arrows upon the steps, which caused the Thenns to die to a man. Among the dead was Ygritte, who passed away in Jon's arms, having been shot by a brother of the Night's Watch during the foray. Jon was left utterly heartbroken. However, there was little time left to wallow in such heartbreak, as Mance's main force would soon arrive outside the gates of Castle Black, and Donal Noye required all the capable men available to him. Mance initially camped his host half a mile north of the wall, which the Watch spotted during the dark of night. 2 sentries sounded their horns, alerting Noye to the danger, who ordered that barrels of burning pitch be fired from the wall by trebuchet to obtain a greater view of what forces were arrayed against him. A dozen jars of lamp oil were set ablaze by the Watch, which were shoved over the edge one by one to further add to the conflagration. Satin, a brother of the Watch, estimated the total size of the wildling host to be 100,000, which Jon Snow lowered to some 30 to 40,000, supplemented by hundreds of giants and mammoths. On the other side, the wall was defended by some 34 able-bodied brothers. Command of the wall was given to Jon when Donal realized that the Free Folk had no ladders capable of reaching the wall's summit. The one-armed blacksmith instead acknowledged that the battle would be decided at the gates of Castle Black. As a result, he took with him 2 archers and 2 spearmen in order to ensure the gate was held. Upon the wall, the defenders continued to let loose arrows at will, unable to properly aim due to the overall dark of night and distance from their targets. More effective was the hail of rocks thrown by the catapults. However, after a number of hours of this barrage, one of the trebuchets broke down. The wildlings were therefore able to avoid the places where the rocks were launched by the remaining trebuchet, rendering it ineffective as the battle continued blindly throughout the night. The Free Folk brought a ram towards the gate as the sun rose. The wildling forces were arrayed with some 100 mammoths mounted by giants at the center, with giants on foot at either side of this central portion of the line. The flanks comprised horsemen, archers, spearmen, slingers, and bone chariots on either side of the heavyweight center. Once within range, Jon ordered that the men upon the wall let loose continued volleys of arrows, while spiked steel caltrops were fired upon the attackers. This onslaught was continued until the giants carrying the ram were either dead or too wounded to carry on, with the remaining force routed by a combination of fire arrows and barrels of burning oil. Despite driving back most of the wildling host, the day was not a total victory for the defenders. The giants below had managed to break the outer studded oak gate, and Magmar Tundaweg, the chieftain of the giants, was able to crawl through and reach the iron gate. The 5 warriors of the Watch engaged in a desperate final stand with the giant, and in the end all 6 were slain, sacrificing themselves to a man to bring down the king of the giants. Jon and 3 other members of the Watch, including Maester Aemon, subsequently entered the tunnel. However, in a turn of good fortune, they found that a slain mammoth now blocked the entrance to the damaged gate. Jon ordered that the secondary gate be blocked up with rubble ice and whatever debris could be found in short order. As he attempted to yield command to Sir Stout as the last remaining knight in the castle, Aemon informed him that Sir Stout was no longer able to fulfill such a role, and command had in fact passed to Jon. The battle would drag on for many days, with neither side capable of fully exhausting the other. However, this was not a stalemate, for the longer the conflict continued, the more likely it was for the wildlings to grasp victory. This was due to the fact that the Watch was already running low on supplies, having run out of oil and barrels of pitch, along with their stockpile of arrows. Word soon reached Castle Black of the victory at the Bridge of Skulls, where the greater force of men from Castle Black, led by Bowen Marsh, defeated a wildling force led by the Weeper at the gorge near Shadow Tower. Jon was now fully aware that no further aid from the Watch would be forthcoming, and when he called upon the people of Molestown to join in the defense, he discovered that the settlement had been abandoned. In the interim, the Free Folk had constructed a device which came to be known as the Turtle. It was described as a hull turned upside down and opened fore and aft, a long hall on wheels. The Turtle had a rounded top and 8 huge wheels, and beneath it was a stout wooden frame covered with numerous layers of raw mammoth skin atop sheepskin and pelts, in order to avoid it being set alight. The fire arrows which the Watch loosed upon it were therefore rendered redundant, and it was only due to the quick thinking of Jon that the defense held. Realizing that this huge siege engine could be crushed as it drew close enough, Jon sought out the aid of Gren, Owen the Oaf and kegs, and with them pushed 4 stout oaken barrels filled with crushed rocks off the side of the wall. This caused the wildlings to flee as the Turtle splintered from the front, leaving the Free Folk attempting to clear the debris vulnerable to a barrage of arrows. This had bought the Watch time in their defense of the wall, yet this was but a momentary respite in the unfurling onslaught which had been loosed upon them, as the Watch now stood alone, or so it seemed. Time and again, the Night's Watch had thrown back the tide of Free Folk, which sought to overwhelm the defences of Castle Black. However, each successful repulsion came at a huge cost to the already depleted Brotherhood. One would believe that the return of Sir Alistair Thorne and Janos Slynt would bring with them a degree of intelligence and leadership nous, which could prove pivotal in the dying embers of the conflict. However, this perception would prove to be a misguided one, as the duo immediately sowed discord within the ranks by having Jon Snow imprisoned for desertion. To strengthen their charges against the Bastard of Winterfell, the already imprisoned Rattleshirt was brought forward to testify against the nascent Jon Snow. Rattleshirt subsequently confirmed the accusations, informing the Night's Watch of Jon's actions in slaying Corin Halfhand upon the Frostfangs. This was all the testimony Sir Alistair and Janos required, and they subsequently ignored any explanation given by Jon, who tried in vain to explain Corin's final instructions to his jailers. Maester Aemon was then forced to intervene to ensure Jon was not summarily executed by sending a raven to Cotter Pike at Eastwatch. This swift and pertinent action saved the life of the Bastard of Winterfell, confined to the ice cells for 4 days as the stalemate outside the wall continued. Fortunately for the Night's Watch and the denizens whom they protected from the wildling tide, this was not to be the only act of Maester Aemon which was to pay dividends, for the elderly Maester had sent ravens far and wide throughout the Seven Kingdoms, seeking the intervention of the great lords of the land. The vast majority of these ravens fell upon deaf ears, with events of a supposed grander scale transpiring throughout Westeros. One such letter would, however, make its way to Dragonstone, where a certain Stannis Baratheon now resided after his defeat at the hands of the Lannisters in the Battle of the Blackwater. Although the rightful heir of Robert now found himself at equally as low an ebb as that of his compatriots now manning the wall, the importance of wise counsel at a crossroads moment was once more to be shown. In this instance, it was to come in the form of the ever-loyal and honest to a fault former smuggler Davos Seaworth. At the time, Davos's position in court was anything but sincere. This was due to the fact that the Red Woman, Melisandre, through her dark machinations, counselled to have Robert's bastard, Edric Storm, sacrificed to wake a stone dragon beneath the fortress. To ensure this would not come to pass, Davos, alongside several men who had recanted from the faith of R'hllor, smuggled the bastard from the island to leave him under the care of Sir Andrew Estamont. The response of the king evoked the words of House Baratheon: "Ours is the fury," as Stannis believed that Davos had now thrown away their final chance at a hasty resolution to the War of the Five Kings. Davos was, fortunately, able to sway the unruly Baratheon from the dark path Melisandre was leading him down. Urging his king to set sail for the wall, he handed him the letter from Maester Aemon, before stating, "A king protects his people, or he is no king at all." Stannis, a man wed to duty, accepted this call for aid, and allowed Melisandre to sacrifice a man to R'hllor, which gained the fleet favourable winds on their voyage north. His wife and daughter, Khaleesi and Shireen, were left at Eastwatch by the Sea, before marching with all haste and in full force to meet the King beyond the Wall and fulfill his duty of protecting his people as the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms. At the Wall, the Night's Watch, unaware of their impending salvation, continued their dogged defence in the absence of their charismatic young leader. However, having suffered 4 days alone within the ice cells, Jon was required once more to fulfill his role as a brother of the Night's Watch. The King beyond the Wall, Mance Rayder, had requested a parley, which Sir Alliser and Janos believed to be a ploy. As such, they selected Jon Snow as their envoy to the Wildlings, believing they were sending the bastard to his death. Exhausted and still feeling the effects of his time within the ice cells, Jon was carried over the wall by way of the winch cage with the secret order of assassinating Mance. Tormund escorted the young crow to Mance's tent, where the negotiations would take place. The King beyond the Wall took a hard line throughout these negotiations, and immediately informed Jon that the warg Varamir Sixskins had utilised his eagle to gauge the number of the Night's Watch men remaining. The depleted numbers of the defenders had given Mance cause to be confident, a confidence which was further bolstered by his possession of the Horn of Winter, which, if the legends were to be believed, was capable of bringing down the wall. However, in a moment of candour, Mance revealed that it was not his wish to destroy the wall. Rather, he would utilise it to protect his people from the looming threat of the White Walkers. Therefore, the former ranger suggested a compromise whereby he would hand over the horn if he and his people were allowed to pass through the gates and make a home for themselves in the south. This compromise came with an important caveat that the free folk would not yield to the laws of southern lords, and would abide by their own rules and customs. If the offer were rejected, dire consequences would follow for the Brotherhood, for Tormund would sound the horn at dawn some 3 days later, ending the defence of Castle Black in one fell swoop of mythical proportions. At this point, Jon was left with yet another of the difficult decisions which had come to define him. Whether to sacrifice his honour and kill Mance, saving the Watch in the process, or return to the Wall with the offer which had been presented to him. However, just as Jon was to make his choice, the king and envoy's attention was drawn to the sound of a war horn coming from the east. Mance immediately jumped into action, attempting to organise a hasty defence of the camp. This defence was to be in vain, and the hope of yet another king beyond the wall was to be dashed just as they reached the moment of their supposed inevitable triumph. A combined force of some 1,500 knights, mounted soldiers, mounted bowmen and men-at-arms, supplemented by an unquantified number of experienced rangers from Eastwatch, had swept down upon the camp. The oncoming charge of the heavy Baratheon horse was comparable to the strength and ferocity of a tidal wave, and the onslaught proved unstoppable, decimating the wildling lines in a matter of moments. Melisandre likewise played her part in the conflict, burning Varamir's eagle from the sky, which caused the wildling wargs to be cast to the ground in brutal spasms of pain. Events went from bad to worse for Mance when his wife Dalla went into labour due to the stress of the situation, leaving only Jon and Val to assist her within the tent. Harma Dogshead, who led the vanguard of the wildling force, was quickly cut down in this initial charge, while Tormund's son Dormund was also slain by a knight, presumed to be Sir Richard Horpe. The chaos which ensued even caught Jon unawares, who, rather than join the battle, defended Mance's tent, unsure of who his would-be saviours even were. And through the smoke another wedge of armoured riders came on barded horses. Floating above them were the largest banners yet, royal standards as big as sheets, a yellow one with long pointed tongues that showed a flaming heart, and another like a sheet of beaten gold, with a black stag prancing and rippling in the wind. Robert, Jon thought for one mad moment, remembering poor Owen. But when the trumpets blew again and the knights charged, the name they cried was Stannis, Stannis, Stannis. The battle, if one would deign to call it such, was effectively ended when the horse of Mance Rayder was slain beneath him, which caused the wildling lines to break in their entirety. The giants, however, would not surrender or flee, and fought desperately against the Southrons, with Sir Godfrey Faring bringing low one of their number, a feat which earned him the moniker Giant Slayer. At the conclusion of the slaughter, Mance, alongside 1,000 other members of the Free Folk, was taken prisoner. Alongside their number were Val and Mance's newborn son, who would be named Aemon Steelsong, for whom Dalla had given her life in childbirth. After his triumph, Stannis took up residence in Castle Black, occupying the King's Tower, from where he was to plan his next move in order to claim his birthright of the Iron Throne. The former Lord of Dragonstone was quick to assess the options available to him, and offered to legitimize Jon Snow and name him Lord of Winterfell in return for helping him secure the loyalty of the North. Moreover, Jon was to be wed to Val, which Stannis believed would ensure the loyalty of the Free Folk, who could potentially bolster his own forces in the fight with the Boltons. The Night's Watch was also forced to begin the vote for the new Lord Commander following the death of Jeor Mormont at Craster's Keep. However, the Watch remained a disunified organisation, and after 10 days of deliberations, no such Lord Commander had been decided upon. This frustrated Stannis, who wished to negotiate over possession of the new gift and a number of the castles of the Watch. Stannis' patience continued to wane during this stalemate, and he threatened to choose a Lord Commander for them if they could not do so themselves. Samwell Tarly quickly realised that Janos Slynt was on the verge of winning the vote. Through his own initiative, Sam negotiated with Sir Dennis Mallister and Cotter Pike, who held command of the Shadow Tower and Eastwatch by the Sea, to give up their claim to the Lord Commandership and support Jon instead. As a result, Jon Snow was elected to the position of Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, entirely unaware of his own candidacy and during a period in which he was still deliberating upon Stannis' offer. Having refused the offer of the king, a disbelieving Jon was subsequently elected the 998th Lord Commander, to the chagrin of Stannis, who had hoped to use him in a role which could quickly turn the tide against the Boltons throughout the north. However, Stannis remained a practical and rational man, and quickly pivoted in order to ensure he could still make the most of his current position. Having gleaned what he could of the White Walkers from those present in Castle Black, word was hastily sent to the Castellan of Dragonstone, Sir Roland Storm, to begin mining dragonglass to counter the threat posed. Allowance was also made for the free folk to pass through the wall and settle within the gift. However, this offer hinged upon the willingness of the wildlings to convert to the worship of R'hllor, an offer which was taken up by the Lord of Bones and the newly minted leader of the Thenns, Siggon, who led their followers south. Mance Rayder was supposedly burned at the stake for treason and defiance, but unbeknownst to those who would witness the execution, the individual who was killed was not Mance, but Rattleshirt. Stannis would require a man of Mance's talents in what was to come, and as such, allowed Melisandre to place a glamour upon the unfortunate Rattleshirt, leading the majority of those living within the north to believe the king beyond the wall had perished. Those who came south only made up a minority of the wildlings who had survived the battle. A far greater proportion of the remaining freefolk had fled into the haunted forest. Many followed a rider who led them to the Milkwater, with hundreds more following a warrior of dour temperament to Thenn. The vast majority followed Mother Mole to Hardhome, a number estimated by Bowen Marsh to be some 6,000 wildlings, while a further 3,000 wildlings followed Tormund. As one of his first acts as Lord Commander, Jon Snow sent Val into the haunted forest to find Tormund and begin negotiations with his one-time friend and ally. However, Jon's amiable and reconciliatory treatment of the wildlings would ultimately widen the rift amongst the Brotherhood, which, even in the direct aftermath of the battle beneath the wall, had begun to fester. As the dust settled upon the twin shocks of the victory over the wildlings and the election of Jon Snow to the post of Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, an uneasy status quo was established. Stannis took up residence within the King's Tower, whereas Jon Snow assumed the quarters of the now deceased Donal Noye. Jon's first act as Lord Commander was to institute mandatory archery practice for all members of the Watch stationed within Castle Black. Immediately, his tenure was beset with tension, for Jon quickly realised that his new royal ally Stannis may pose a threat to Maester Aemon and Mance's son, who may consider burning them at the stake for his Red God due to their royal blood. As a preventative measure, Mance's son was swapped with Gilly's child, and Samwell Tarly was sent away to train to be a steward at the Citadel with Aemon, Gilly and the child in tow. Stannis, meanwhile, had taken on the title of King of Westeros, and had already hatched plans to use Val to seal the peace between the men of the North and the wildlings. Furthermore, as part of the agreement between Jon and Stannis, food and shelter were to be provided to Stannis' warriors. This was in conjunction with Stannis assuming control of and garrisoning the Night Fort, and also being granted leave to settle those amongst the free folk who would come south of the wall. Ravens were also sent to the Lords of the North, demanding their fealty to the rightful king. However, only House Karstark responded, swearing their allegiance to Stannis. Events in the north had not gone unnoticed in King's Landing, where Queen Cersei, dangerously deprived of her father's better judgment and steady temperament, assumed the reins of power. Soon after becoming aware of Stannis' movements, the Lannisters assembled an expeditionary force with the intent of capturing Dragonstone. Cersei considered 2,000 Lannister soldiers to be sufficient for this operation, which were ferried across Blackwater Bay by the Redwyne fleet and encamped outside the fortress. Before Dragonstone could be claimed, urgent threats elsewhere arose. The newly ascendant King of the Isles and the North, Euron Greyjoy, had recently seized the Shield Islands, and the only fleet in Westeros capable of going toe-to-toe with his was the Redwyne one. Knowing his homeland to be under direct threat of Ironborn raids, Sir Loras Tyrell begged Cersei to send word to Lord Redwyne to lift the siege and meet the Iron Fleet in battle before they could ravage the Reach. Callously dismissive of the Reachmen's plight, Cersei refused this request, believing the threat posed by the garrison at Dragonstone to be a higher priority. Thus, in an act of desperation, Loras begged to be sent to Dragonstone so he could help end the siege there earlier, thereby freeing up the Redwyne fleet to defend the Reach. Loras quickly made his way to the island, whereupon he immediately took command of the operation. The youthful yet talented Kingsguard immediately offered single combat as a method of resolving the conflict, hoping to force Dragonstone's garrison leader, Sir Roland Storm, to duel with him outside the walls. This was declined, and as such, Loras pressed for time and was left with little option but to storm the fortress. In the ensuing assault, Loras led from the front, and the gate was breached, with much loss of life on the attackers' part. Following this breach, the defenders hastily retreated to the keep, which was assaulted in short order. During his reckless charge, Sir Loras was grievously wounded, suffering a blow from a mace, featherings by an arrow and a crossbow bolt, and boiling oil being poured on top of him. However, as a testament to his grim bodily sacrifice, the Lannisters successfully captured Dragonstone, with massive casualties of some 1,000 men, most of which were the youngest and most promising flower of King Tommen's army in the aftermath. Sir Loras was now ostensibly on death's door on the shores of Dragonstone. However, the Redwyne fleet was now free to return and counter the Ironborn incursion. Cersei would also task Lord Roose Bolton, now assuming the mantle of Warden of the North, to deal with the direct threat of Stannis and his freshly victorious army. Cersei was likewise furious over appointing a scion of House Stark to the role of Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, bastard or not. As a result, the small council agreed that Lord Snow must be removed from command. Initial suggestions for dealing with the matter included Grand Maester Pycelle's proposition that the Crown should refuse to send any further recruits until Jon was removed from command. However, Qyburn's proposal was much more to the Queen Regent's liking, for he suggested that 100 recruits should be sent to the Wall with specific orders to execute the bastard son of Ned Stark. Cersei bought into this plot and made arrangements to send one Sir Osney Kettleblack as the head of such a force. However, before this plan could move beyond the conception stage, both Cersei and Osney were imprisoned by the Faith of the Seven. Back in the north, matters were proceeding less smoothly for the nascent Lord Commander, as he suffered constant harassment from the king's men amongst Stannis' warriors. This culminated in the Red Priestess advising Jon to keep his direwolf ghost nearby at all times, due to the threat of daggers in the dark. However, the full capability of Melisandre to provide true and accurate portents of the future remained in doubt, as Maester Aemon, on his journey to the Citadel, became convinced that she had been mistaken in declaring Stannis as Azor Ahai Reborn. Perhaps due to the fact that through omen and the tenuous interpretation of ancient prophecy, it was Jon who was set to become the leader his people required in such uncertain times. As such, Jon found the will to resist the indomitable Stannis, and rejected his proposals to assume control of all the unoccupied castles on the Wall, thereby asserting the Night's Watch's sovereignty from the Baratheon army. Further pressures also mounted from within the Night's Watch, in the guise of a certain Janos Slynt, who had played an active role in the death of Jon's father. Jon ordered the former leader of the Goldcloaks to garrison the abandoned fortress of Greyguard. However, believing himself to be above such a task, Janos rejected him outright. For the crime of refusing the direct command of the Lord Commander, Slynt was sentenced to death by hanging. However, in recalling the lessons of his father and the laws of the First Men, Jon decided to personally behead Janos Slynt himself. The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, an act which gained the respect of Stannis, and effectively cemented Jon's position among the Watch's newfound allies. In a further attempt to reoccupy some of the abandoned forts, Jon would then send his friends Grenn and Piper to Eastwatch and Holder, and Todder to the Shadow Tower. Unfortunately, still a relatively inexperienced and naive leader, Snow was unaware of the fact that sending away all his allies left him dangerously isolated within Castle Black. This would lead to greater cooperation between the two men, although disagreements over Mance's fate would lead to the burning of the glamoured Rattleshirt, who members of the Watch subsequently shot under Jon's orders. Stannis would then order the glamoured Mance, disguised as Rattleshirt, to save Jon. The next element of Stannis' plan was the taking of the Dreadfort and the defeat of Roose Bolton, in order to retake the north, which he planned to utilise as a launchpad for his further conquests. Sir Davos was sent to White Harbour in order to sway Lord Wyman Manderley to his side for the conflict to come. The support of half of House Umber was also won, with their leader, Morse Umber, pledging his men for the battle. However, the house was still divided, as the Great Johns remained captives of the Lannisters. Now, with as much support as he believed necessary, Stannis made preparations for an immediate march upon the Dreadfort, which had been left vulnerable by Ramsay Bolton, as he had left to retake Moat Cailin from the Ironborn. Fortunately for the last surviving Baratheon, Jon offered his counsel, forcing him to acknowledge that the plan was doomed to fail, as his wildling warriors would turn the north against him, and they would be spotted long before they reached the Dread Fort. Jon instead advised that Stannis meet with the mountain clans, foremost amongst them the Flints, Wells, Norries and Liddles, who would be more likely to pledge to the king. Jon further suggested the target of Deepwood Motte, which could be more easily taken from the Ironborn. Meanwhile, Sir Davos Seaworth was taken captive by Sir Wyman Manderley, who pretended to execute him to appease the Boltons, while secretly working against his new overlords in the Dreadfort, secretly promising Sir Davos his support if the old smuggler could find Rickon Stark. Stannis began his march south, swaying many of the mountain folk to his side, and engaging the Ironborn at Deepwood Motte. Stannis' 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers were able to quickly overwhelm the 200 Ironborn led by Asher Greyjoy, who was captured attempting to retreat from the battle. In the aftermath, Deepwood Motte was returned to the Glovers, which won much popular support for Stannis throughout the north. Meanwhile, Roose Bolton had returned to the north at the head of a combined force of Boltons and Freys, yet most surprisingly of all with Arya Stark in tow. However, this woman, who was hastily married to the newly legitimized Ramsay Bolton, was not actually Arya Stark but an impostor whose name was Jane Poole, the daughter of the deceased steward of Winterfell. Therefore, the Boltons, with their dubiously aligned allies from House Dustin, Hornwood, Umber, Cerwyn Ryswell and Manderley, remained holed up in Winterfell, anticipating the coming of the Baratheons. This resulted in schisms within Stannis' army, for the Northerners within it advised a march upon Winterfell to save Arya, while the Southrons disagreed, with Stannis favouring the former. "We all know what my brother would do. Robert would gallop up to the gates of Winterfell alone, break them with his warhammer, and ride through the rubble to slay Roose Bolton with his left hand and the bastard with his right. I am not Robert, but we will march and we will free Winterfell, or die in the attempt." So began the march upon Winterfell. Led by guides provided by Lady Sibel Glover, the Baratheon forces made great time upon their march for the first 3 days. However, on the fourth, the snow began to fall, grinding progress to a near halt. The combination of the freezing cold and depleted supplies caused casualties to mount. Upon the 34th day, while little more than a few days' march from Winterfell, the entire army found itself snowed in. Further north, Morse Umber and Arnulf Karstark had earlier begun their march to Winterfell, but treachery lay in their midst. Arnulf was secretly in league with Roose. Having earlier attempted to trick Stannis into marching upon the Dreadfort, Arnulf instead planned to wait for a signal from Roose before betraying the would-be King of Westeros. Stannis' army began to cut holes into the ice lakes near the Crofters village where they were now encamped, but not enough fish could be found, and the casualties continued to mount. The Queen's men would then begin to conduct human sacrifices by way of burning those accused of cannibalism in the hopes of ending the storm. Soon after, Tycho Nestoris, a banker from Braavos, arrived, accompanied by Theon Greyjoy and the escaped Arya Stark. The banker was to prove pivotal, as he informed Stannis of Arnulf's treachery, who was taken captive and his men were subsequently disarmed. Roose, meanwhile, in an attempt to deal with the discord among his ranks within Winterfell, sent out the forces of House Manderley and Frey. However, Sir Aenys died from falling into a pit dug by Morse Umber outside the main gates and breaking his neck. Stannis, confident of victory in the battle to come, lay in wait within the village, prepared to end the Boltons' tenure as Wardens of the North for good and all. Back at Castle Black, Jon Snow had suffered similar setbacks in his attempts at leadership in such darkening days. In order to study the Whites, the corpses of dead wildlings were left in the ice cells in the hopes they would arise. whilst the glamoured Mance Rayder was sent to retrieve Arya. Val was sent to treat with Tormund Giantsbane, which infuriated the old guard of the Night's Watch. This situation, which was not aided by Edison Tollett being sent to Long Barrow, further isolated Jon. A loan was also agreed with Tycho Nestoris before he headed south towards Stannis, and Jon quickly and efficiently dealt with a potential dispute with the Karstarks. However, now realizing the true potency of the White Walkers, Cotter Pike was sent to bring the wildlings at Hardhome south in order to avoid adding greater numbers to the hordes of the undead. Val also successfully brought Tormund to Castle Black to treat with the Lord Commander, which would force a number of hard discussions with the likes of Torgen Flint and Brandon Norrie as to the necessity of bringing wildlings south of the Wall. Despite the harsh opposition to this plan, Jon did what he felt was right, and allowed Tormund to bring his 3,000 wildlings south. Jon subsequently intended to relieve Cotter at Hardhome, who had experienced difficulties there and remained effectively trapped. However, a letter from Winterfell was to alter the course of Jon's future. Ramsay Bolton had written indicating that Stannis had been defeated and Mance captured, which caused Jon to give up command of the ranging to Hardhome and announce his intention to ride south and put the Boltons to the sword. Jon was unwilling to command the Night's Watch to aid him in this endeavour. However, he welcomed any support from wildlings and any brothers of the Watch who volunteered their service. The majority of the wildlings within the Shield Hall ardently declared their support for Jon, but the discontent among the upper echelons of the Watch's command was soon to turn deadly. In a scuffle which resulted in the giant 1-1 slaying Sir Patrick of King's Mountain, Jon was attacked in what came to be known as the Mutiny at Castle Black. In response to the breaking of his oath, the brothers, led by Bowen Marsh, began to stab Jon. Amongst their number was Wick Whittlestick, who plunged his blade into his former Lord Commander with tears in his eyes, whilst repeatedly muttering, "For the Watch." The Lord Commander and supposed bastard son of Ned Stark lay despairing upon the snow, staring into a darkening sky as he continued to bleed out and grow ever colder. Having fought for so long, his final well-deserved rest seemed imminent, or so we are led to believe. This is a story to be concluded with the release of Winds of Winter, but in the meantime, we plan to cover the battles of many other fantasy, sci-fi and space opera universes, so make sure you have subscribed and pressed the bell button. Please consider liking and sharing, as it helps immensely, and don't forget to comment. We'll try to read and respond to every comment, as we want to know what you think about this video and which videos you hope to see in the future. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.